Hello, cinefans. I'm Kendall Groover, and this is Watching Classic Movies. My guest, Martin Turnbull, is the author of several novels, including the 9-book Garden of Allah series, and his latest, All the Gin Joints. We talked about the history of the Garden of Allah Hotel and how it has influenced his writing. Welcome, Martin. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'm fascinated by how you talked about your Garden of Allah novels being a microcosm of the studio system. Can you elaborate a little bit on how this series came to be and what you hoped to do with it?
Sure. So I had written a few novels before, and they were okay. They were okay, but they weren't really quite at the publishing level to take forward. So I was casting around for a new idea, and I came across an article on the Garden of Allah Hotel. And I started reading it, and I started reading the caliber of people who lived at there. We're talking Dorothy Parker and Errol Flynn and Myrna Loy and Ginger Rogers and Bodie and McCall. I'm thinking, wait. I have been reading about these people ever since Lauren Bacall came out with her autobiography in the 70s. It was the first one I read, and I've been reading Hollywood-themed biographies and memoirs ever since. And that was a long time ago, and yet I've never heard of this place. What's this? And so I did a bit of digging. I thought somebody must have written about this. And one person had written one book, and it was Sheila Graham, who was a gossip columnist who I'd also not heard of. She was third in line after Luella Parsons and Hedda Hopper. Mm-hmm. Sheila Graham was like the next one. And I'd never heard of her. And she had been there because she had dated F. Scott Fitzgerald, who had been a resident at the Garden of Allah Hotel. And I'm thinking, what? So I tracked down her book at the LA Public Library, and within, I want to say, page 10, I knew exactly what I wanted to do and how I wanted to do it, because I realized that the hotel opened in 1927, a couple of months before the jazz singer introduced talkies to the movie.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then it closed in 1959, which, at least to my mind, was the end of the studio era of Hollywood. It kind of petered out in the 60s, but to my mind, it ended with Ben-Hur and Some Like It Hot, and that was kind of the end of the studio era. So this hotel that opened in 27 at the start of the Golden Era, and it closed in 59, the end of the Golden Era, it was open for the 32 years of the Golden Era of what we now see as the Golden Era of Studio Hollywood. And I thought, well, I could tell the history of that era, that tumultuous, ever-changing history of this part of this time and place that I'm particularly interested in, through the eyes of the people who lived at this hotel, because they were real people who were doing real jobs. They were acting in these movies. They were writing them, directing them, lighting them, scoring them. They actively contributed to the ongoing history of Hollywood. These weren't the bean counters. These were the actors and actresses and screenwriters. So I could tell the story of the history of Hollywood through the eyes of these people who actually lived it and lived there at the Garden of Allah Hotel. The more I thought about it, the more I saw that the Garden of Allah Hotel was a microcosm of the larger Hollywood film industry, because these were the creative people who were creating these now iconic images, these iconic careers and legendary movies that we now look back on very fondly. And so that's the approach I took, that this hotel was a microcosm of what was going on in larger Hollywood. And so I structured my series that way. It ended up being 9 books, where we go through the history of Hollywood, because the other thing I realized was that every couple of years, technology changed Hollywood. We went from silent to talkies, and after we got that under our belt, along comes Technicolor, to go from black and white to Technicolor, and that evolves into the peak of the Hollywood era, which is 1939. We've got Gone with the Wind, we've got Citizen Kane, and just as we're wrapping our mind around that, Citizen Kane being a game changer itself, questioning the most powerful man in Hollywood, we've got the war. The war starts. Pearl Harbor happens. So now Hollywood goes from being a commercial film factory and kind of shifts into being a propaganda film factory. And I use propaganda in a good way. It was all part of the cause. So that went to the Hollywood, the war years. And then after the war, it sort of devolved into the rise of the Red Scare and the anti-communism and the blacklist, and things kind of fell apart. And then they sort of got together a bit just in time for the rise of television, which meant that Hollywood had to reinvent itself. It had to invent widescreen formats and surround sound formats and 3D formats and do whatever they could to attract moviegoers back into the theaters, because they could just stay home and watch it on the TV screen. But no, they had to reinvent the game. So every couple of years, Hollywood had to reinvent itself because something changed technologically or sociologically or historically. So it was a very intense period. And as a writer, I want my characters to go through intense period where there's lots of change and challenges, so that they could come out of that hopefully better, fuller, bigger people than they went in. And that's why I chose the Garden of Valor, because it just fitted all those criteria. Plus, it was a real place, and I like to, as an author of historical fiction, I like to anchor my stories with as much accurately historical detail as I can. And the Garden of Valor was this gift that just kept on giving.
It is clear that you know your Hollywood history, just from the details and the way you really peg the kind of celebrities, the stars that come through. Tallulah Bankhead feels like Tallulah Bankhead, for instance, in these books. Marion Davies feels like Marion Davies. So to the setting, the Garden of Allah, what did you learn about the hotel as you researched for this book? Or how much did you know before you even started it?
I knew very little of it. It kind of amazed me that I'd never heard of this place that turned out to be so central to Hollywood's social life. So what I learned was that the Garden of Allah Hotel was different from all the other hotels in the area and the era, because it didn't start out life as a hotel. It started out life as the mansion of a movie star. And it wasn't just any movie star, it was this grand Russian dramatic actress by the name of Alla Nazimova. And she arrived in Hollywood in 1918 with a huge contract by Metro to start her movie career. Well, a big movie star needs a big movie star home. She looked around, she found this house that was vacant on the corner of Sunset Boulevard and Crescent Heights. So she secured it, and then she spent another $50,000 doing it up to her taste. It stood on a huge property, 2.5 acres. And so she developed this huge garden and that she landscaped. And her name is Allah. And at the time, there was a popular book called The Garden of Allah. So the property, the estate, naturally got this nickname, The Garden of Allah, Allah without an H, because she was Allah without an H, Nazimova. And it just became her estate, The Garden of Allah. But Allah wasn't just a dramatic film star and Broadway star. She was actually quite intelligent, quite articulate. She learned English in 6 months, so she was no dum-dum.
Yeah.
But she took a look around the late 19-teens Hollywood, and I think she found it rather less stimulating than she had hoped. So she started to gather around her this coterie of intellectuals and people who could talk about interesting things. So she would gather writers and musicians and opera singers and philosophers, and they would gather on Saturday nights. She would have these salons, rather like Gertrude Stein was doing in Paris, and these intelligent, articulate, ambitious people would talk about philosophy and letters and art and sculpture and music and history. So her address became very well known as an interesting place where interesting people gathered to talk about interesting things. And so when she fell on hard times in the mid-20s, and somebody came to her and said, you know what, you've got this big property right in the heart of town. We could build these villas around what's ostensibly now your backyard, and it would be a hotel that would have this cash flow going on to provide cash. If this movie career peters out, because it's kind of petering out for a bunch of reasons, you'd be set. And it was a good idea. And so she said, yep, here's a bunch of money. You guys turn my place into a hotel. I'm going back on the road because I'm really a creature of the theatre. So I'm going back to theatre, and you build this hotel. So they did. And it opened in January 1927. And it was a huge hit because Alla Nazimova had built this reputation of this address, which was 8080 Sunset Boulevard, later changed to 8152 Sunset Boulevard at some point. I can't quite figure out when. But anyway, this particular address had its own reputation. So people were thinking, I've always heard about Mr. River's estate and how fascinating it is, and now I can stay there? Well, sign me up.
Yeah.
And so right from the get-go, interesting people stayed at the Garden of Valor. The other interesting thing was, and I think this is really what cemented the Garden of Valor's reputation, and that's because these villas that were built were self-contained units. They had little kitchens, they had dining areas, and so people wouldn't check into the hotel like they would now. Like we would check into the Holiday Inn for a night or two and then be on our way. These people got contracts at the studios, and so they were here for a while. Maybe not forever, but Scott Fitzgerald got a contract at MGM for 10 weeks at $1,000 a week, which he sorely needed because he was broke. So he checked into the Garden of Valor because it was a self-contained unit. Ginger Rogers and her mother checked in there for exactly the same reason. They could save money on meals, and it was a cheaper way to live. So when you've got people who are there for a while, they get to know their neighbours. And if your neighbours, Bogey and Bacall, or their Dorothy Parker, or their Harpo Marx, or their David Niven, they're going to have drinks. And they're probably going to have it by the pool because it's Southern California. You can sit by the pool, 10 months of the year. And if there's a party going on there, you're going to maybe roll up because you're Myrna Loy and you're outgoing and you're ambitious and you're articulate and you're fun. So you want to be with those like-minded people. So the atmosphere around the Garden of Valor, more specifically around the pool of the Garden of Valor, became this, I don't want to say a non-stop party, but it was a very inclusive, because, hey, we're all creative people trying to make it in a tough industry. So if you've got that role in The Thin Man, then, hey, let's celebrate that, because we know how hard it is to climb to the top of the Hollywood ladder. So let's all celebrate what it is to be doing what we're doing. And if one of us can pull ahead and be noticed, then, hey, let's celebrate that. So we have a whole convivial, supportive, outgoing atmosphere at the Garden of Valor that just kept on going. It just kept on going because people checked in, people checked out, people came back, people recommended their friends, people, new Shifter Studios, worked with that director who directed that movie that starred that person that's now my neighbor. Oh, so we've got something to talk about. Everybody always had something to talk about at the Garden of Valor. So it was that kind of welcoming place for people who were going to be here for a while and not just for, the weekend.
And when you said inclusive, does that mean that people at different levels of work in the studio were friendly with each other? So somebody who's just getting started, would they interact with the stars, or was there more of a separation as far as that was concerned?
The impression that I've got is that everybody's welcome. Everybody's here. Because, when Dorothy Parker came to Hollywood to write for the movies, she was already, quote-unquote, Dorothy Parker, and a very well-known voice with her buddy, Robert Benchley, who was also a very well-known person, because they were part of the Algonquin Round Table. Most of the Algonquin Round Table came to Hollywood because Hollywood dangled these big fat checks. And, hey, it was the Depression. We never knew when our next buck was going to come from. We didn't know if our next book was going to be a success. But if MGM is offering me $1,000 a week to write a screenplay, hey, I'll come. So they would come to a place like the Garden of Valor. More often they would come to the Garden of Valor, where they would already know at least a few people there. And if you're Ginger Rogers, some little nobody here to take your chances, but you're very good on the tennis court, which Ginger was, and you're looking for a tennis partner, it wasn't hard to find somebody to partner up, and you play a few games, or let's have a few drinks after the tennis game. You're a really good player. You should play with this person because they're better than I am. Oh, and let me introduce you to Errol Flynn or whoever. So it didn't take long for people to meet other people because it was quite a welcoming atmosphere. The other thing, while I think of it, that the Garden of Valor had going for it, that as far as I know, any quote-unquote decent hotel had going for it, was that it didn't have a house detective. Now, this is the era where quote-unquote nice hotels, good hotels, had a house detective to make sure that Mr. and Mrs. Smith checking in are actually Mr. and Mrs. Smith and married to each other and not his mistress or his secretary or some cheap loser you picked up on the street and put in for a fun time. That didn't happen at the Garden of Allah. Nobody was looking, nobody was checking, nobody was caring. So human nature, being human nature, when nobody's looking, you go for it. So kind of everybody was doing the same thing, whether it was partaking of Prohibition era bootleg, that wasn't a problem, or Cuban cigars, or having an affair because the person sneaking home to their villa at 6 o'clock on a Sunday morning were probably doing the exact same thing that you were doing on Saturday night. Nobody cares. Nobody's keeping tabs. So we're all just being who we are rather than pretending to be who the production code that we have to work by that insists everybody is nice and everybody's squeaky clean and nobody's doing anything naughty. Well, that's work. But hey, this is our private time and we can do what we like because at the Garden of Allah, nobody cares.
The vibe almost makes me think of the 60s. The come together, maybe the experimentation of it. It's so much that.
Yeah, but just doing it in 1920s and 1930s style. Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
Which I suppose that, that's been, connections been drawn before. But it brings me to the question of, were there other hotels that had anything near that feeling? Because you mentioned the House Detective. It seems like maybe this is set up to be something a little bit different.
Yeah, as far as I know, no, not really. Not in the same way. The hotel was a well-known hotel. Among the hotels of Los Angeles during this era, it would have been like the most well-known of, say, 6 hotels. And the other ones were all quote-unquote respectable hotels that would have had somebody watching to make sure that no funny business was going on. Of course funny business was going on. This is Hollywood. So of course it was, but in terms of a patina of respectability, the other hotels at least made sure that not a lot of it was going on. At the Garden of Allah, no holds barred. There was no rules. It was do whatever you like because nobody was looking. On the other hotels, as far as I can tell, were more keen to preserve their reputation. And I mean, the Chateau Marmont probably comes closest, and that was for the difference between the chateau, which was across the street, so it's interesting that they were basically facing each other across Sunset Boulevard.
That is interesting. So as far as I can tell from my research, the Chateau Marmont is where you took your mistress if you were a studio head. The Garden of Allah is where you took your mistress if you were a writer or an actor, or a little bit further down the food chain. That's basically the difference. I don't know if the Marmont had a house detective. I suspect not, because it had a somewhat similar reputation of being a place where you could take your mistress or the wife that you're not married to or the person you want to have an affair with. A fair few quotes I've seen have told to me that the studio heads would say to their A-list stars, the ones they had the most reputation to lose, they would say to those stars, look, if you're going to have an affair, take her to the Chateau Marmont and get a room way upstairs, way up there. If you're going to do it at the Chateau Marmont. Well, that's good if you are somebody earning $3,500 a week and you can afford to take them anywhere. You can take them to the Chateau Marmont because people are going to look away. People are going to report. But if you can't afford their prices, down the street, just over there, just right there,
just is the Garden of Allah, and you'll be just as safe. And in fact, you're probably more likely to bump into somebody you know, because the Chateau Marmont is a vertical hotel. There's 10, 12 stories. Whereas the Garden of Allah were these 2-story villas set around a very large swimming pool. In fact, at one point, it was the largest swimming pool in Hollywood. So you had to walk from the street past people's front doors. So you were more likely to encounter people, which is another reason why the Garden of Allah was more friendly, because it was a garden. You didn't walk into a hotel and take an elevator.
Yeah.
You sort of walked you checked in, and then you walked past the swimming pool where there was always somebody hanging out, past a bunch of front doors and villas where people were looking out to your villa. So it was you bump into people more than you would if you were just taking the elevator, like at the Biltmore Hotel, for instance.
So it sounds like it was uniquely set up to be a social environment, and maybe there wasn't anything quite like that hotel in that regard.
Yeah, I don't know. That wasn't the intention, but that's what it quickly became because of the layout and because of the history with Nazimova giving it this special cachet of being an interesting place. It all kind of came together, and the layout and the people it attracted, it all came together to create a unique environment that wasn't to be found in any other LA hotel, or quite frankly, any other hotel I've ever come across.
Did it have a reputation because of that freewheeling thing? I mean, was it looked down upon or celebrated? Like, what was the general feeling about this hotel?
The feeling I get from my research is that it was a well-known hotel, yes. Partly because of the Nazimova history, and partly because as soon as it became a hotel that Dorothy Parker stayed at, that Errol Flynn would stay at in between marriages and or in between homes, and that Bogey stayed there several times, also in between marriages. So it was certainly a well-known hotel. The other reason why it was well-known, it was at Sunset Boulevard and Crescent Heights. Now, if you don't live in Los Angeles, you're not aware that that's the gateway to the Sunset Strip. So, as Prohibition started, which was 1920, the Sunset Strip being outside the jurisdiction of the LAPD, because the LAPD's jurisdiction ended at Crescent Heights. So west of Crescent Heights, which is the start of the Sunset Strip, that's the Sheriff's Department. So the LAPD and all the people whose job it was to look to administer Prohibition, that was out of their reach. So the Sunset Strip happened because it was outside the reach of the police. And so the Garden of Valor was uniquely positioned as being at the gateway to the Sunset Strip. So it became part of the law of the Sunset Strip, which even after Prohibition, probably the strip became even more well-known because of Ciro's and Macambo and all these Hollywood nightclubs that became representative of the glamorous nightlife of Hollywood. It was mostly happening on the Sunset Strip. And right there was the Garden of Valor as well. So it was also geography as well as timing and history that made it a place that people knew of. Definitely they knew. And they knew of it as a freewheeling kind of place where you could just let your hair down and relax. And you'll probably bump into somebody you know because there was always a party going on. And people forget that Los Angeles wasn't always this mega city of 10 million people. We're talking about an era of LA where it was, depending on when you're talking about, less than a million people. So, but it was a company town. And if you worked in the movie industry, you moved around from studio to studio, either as an actor, a director, a screenwriter. So you pretty much knew everybody. Everybody sort of worked with everybody else at some point because you moved from studio to studio. It was very rare for somebody to spend their entire career at Paramount or their entire career at Metro. Eventually, you'd move from places, especially screenwriters and actors. You'd move from studio to studio. So the pool of people that you interacted with, either acted with, or whose scripts you were enacting, it was constantly changing. So, and it was a very social town. These people were very social. It wasn't like an isolating kind of industry. It was a very social and interactive industry, filled with very articulate people, very ambitious people who wanted to do well and who were keen to make their stamp note in the industry. So it was a very interactive people where everybody knew everybody. And that was especially true of Garden of Valor, which is why I saw it as a microcosm, because it was a very interactive place in a very interactive town where everybody knew each other.
And how did that feeling evolve over the years of the hotel's operation?
There were definite eras. I would say from the opening, which was 1927, until after the war, it was a continuous bubbling fervent of people coming and going and coming back and hooking up and meeting people and moving on and then rising their careers and dips in their careers. People were constantly coming and going. It was a place to be and be seen, to meet and be met. And of course, during the war, there was a housing crunch. There wasn't nearly enough housing for all the people streaming into Southern California to work at the war factories. So that was even more so in the war years. And then after the war years, the face of LA changed. In the 30s and 40s, or the 20s and 30s, it was a very fluid town. People would come in, try their luck in Hollywood. Sometimes they would make it. Sometimes they would make it enough. Sometimes they would never make it, and they'd move back home again. So there was a lot of fluidity to the population of LA. But as time went on, the people who made it well enough that they didn't need to stay at a hotel, even a residential hotel like the Garden of Valor. So they were making it well enough to build or buy a house in Brentwood or Beverly Hills or Bel Air or up in the Hollywood Hills. And they were more established in their careers, so they weren't quite so transient. And so as the 40s became the 50s, the regulars were less regular. And in the 50s, the hotel had a series of management changes. Like every few years, somebody decided they'd had enough of this hotel and they'd sell it to somebody else. And with every management change, it seemed the new management cared a little less and spent a little less on upkeep, on keeping the villas in good working order. And over the 50s, it just became more and more seedy. And it became seedier places tend to attract seedier people and less established people. And so by the end of the 1950s, it was pretty run down. It was attracting women of easy virtue who thought they might pick up a quick trick if they laid around the pool in their bikinis or whatever they wore at the time. So it became a little less glamorous than it had been in its pre-war heyday, until it finally got to the final management. There's a couple of guys who bought the hotel, and in time both of them died. And so the ownership of the hotel fell to the widow of one of these men. So this, I'm guessing, little old lady suddenly found herself the owner of a hotel that she didn't want, that she didn't need, that she didn't know what to do with. And that's when she sold to Bart Lytton, who was a financier. He had a savings and loan. And he was the one who bought the hotel and tore it down to redevelop it into a commercial space. But to his credit, he organized a closing night party that happened in August of 1959.
And he didn't have to do that, so that's kind of lovely.
And also what he didn't have to do was, at this party, which is this is a touch I really appreciate, is that the closing night, he invited 3,000 people and told them to come dressed as somebody who was big when the hotel first opened in 1927. So there was Clara Bowes, and there was Ronald Colmans, and there was Valentinos, and there was all these people dressed as in the 1920s. Moreover, they projected one of Alan Zimmer's final movies, a movie called Salome. She made a movie of Oscar Wilde's Salome, and they projected it up on the wall of one of the villas, I guess, maybe the main building. So Alan Zimmer was kind of right at the very end. Her Salome is really, really out there. It's really bonkers. It's really watchable. You can see it on YouTube if you want. But she was there with them right at the very end. She played on the loop all night, so she's with them all night. So the party became one of these legendary Hollywood parties that went all night. The Saturday night bled into the Sunday morning, and come the light, the last of the party goers straggled home, and the last of the people who lived at the hotel packed the last of their belongings, and that was Sunday. And from what I can gather, on the Monday, the bulldozers came in. So right to the very end, this microcosm of Hollywood, right to the very end, Hollywood sets are made of basically balsa wood. There are these flimsy things that are made to look permanent, but you can knock them down with a hammer. And so, true to form, in came the bulldozers, and by the end of that first week after the Garden of Valor closed, it was gone. It was gone, and it was this commercial development came up in its place.
I love that it got some of its former glory back, though, in those last hours.
Yes, it was. If I had a time machine, I have a few places I would go, and that would be one of them. That would be the closing night, probably the opening night too, but especially the closing night of the Garden of Valor. Just to be there, just to sort of breathe in the Garden of Valor air, because it was a very special night. It was special enough for, I think it was Life or Time or one of those magazines sent a photographer along. Thank God, because we have all these photos of these revelers partying and literally falling into the pool fully clothed along with the pool furniture. It looked like it was one heck of a party.
Yes, I can imagine. So I hear that your 9-book series has been optioned. Is that correct? For the possibility of being a show at some point. So yeah, that means many things.
Yeah. So I was working on book 5 or 6 when I got an email from a television and film producer asking me if the screenwrites were available. And I thought, finally, somebody sees the potential in this, because I saw the potential from day one. And I said, yes, they are actually. So we got on the phone and we chatted about the possibility of turning this into a TV series. We talked about how period TV series are very expensive, because you just can't go out on the streets of LA and shoot your TV series. You've got period costumes and period cars. You would need to rebuild the Garden of Valor. My books take place in 1,000 different locations. I've taken advantage of every location. So you've got the MGM commissary, you've got Ciro's and Macambo, and you've got the whole Sunset Strip. So it would take a lot. He said, yes, I know that, but I think I can see this very cinematically. You know, it was funny. I asked him, how did you find my books? And he said, well, my fiancée found your book and was reading Red 1. And we were both sitting in bed reading, and she finished book 1 and she tossed The Garden on Sunset into my lap. And she said, you need to read this. And so he said, so I did. And as I was finishing book 1, she was finishing book 2, which deals with the filming of Gone with the Wind is the main backdrop to book 2. And so she finished book 2. And he said, so is book 2 as good as book 1? And she said, it's better. Which I was glad to hear, because, you know, a writer's book 1 is usually, you know, their very first book, and you like to think that you've improved as a writer as book 2. But I think if you make it to make it through book 2 of my series, you'll enjoy the rest of it, because Hollywood just got bigger, and it got better, and it got brighter, and it got crazier, and the story just expands and expands and expands, which he saw the potential of. So he still has he recently renewed the option, and he said to me that COVID put everybody 2 years behind. He said everything just got put on hold, and of course a few things got approved and greenlit. Most of them were IP, intellectual property, that already had a following, others based on a previous movie or TV series, or it was based on a New York Times best-selling book. But he said the rest of the project, 2-year hold. So he said we're kind of 2 years behind where we were, but he sent me bits and pieces of what he's been pitching around town. And of course, now, which is not the case when we first signed, now is the era of content. Now we've got 10,000 streamers and 10,000 channels and networks that all need content. And of course, all you need is one person to say yes. You need one person to get the potential. And let's face it, to be honest, has the deep pockets to fund something like this, because it would take a lot. And I knew from the get-go, this would take a lot of money to turn these. If you're going to be faithful to what I've written, it's going to take a lot of money to be a faithful reproduction of the story that my books tell, because my story is a big, huge, wide, sweeping saga that covers a lot of territory over 32 years. Yeah. So I'm hopeful. We've had discussions every now and then. He catches me up on where he's at and what he's doing and how it's going, and he's in there pitching it with the best of them. So fingers crossed that we might see these books on our TV screen at some point. But like most people don't realize how long this process takes. Like, for instance, the big TV show of the pandemic was Queen's Gambit, that show about the female chess player.
Anna Taylor, yeah.
That book took 35 years to come to the screen. Nobody saw the potential in it. And I can see why. If you look at a summary, I'm like, well, it doesn't sound very interesting, but the way it was done was just so superb. But still, 35 years. The guy who wrote the novel is dead now. So it took so long and so much patience to pitch and revise to get it to where it was a point where somebody was happy to greenlight it, and it did. It became a huge success, and that's a period piece as well.
Yeah.
So that gave me hope that it is still possible to pitch a show that's not set in current times, that doesn't have witches or warlocks or aliens or serial killers or rogue cops or CIA agents or all the other things that most shows have. I don't have any of that. So if that's your thing, then perhaps this isn't your thing. But if you want to take a detailed peek into a unique time and place, then if a TV show gets made of it, it might be right up your alley.
Well, I feel like we're in a world where there's Mank, and there's been some period
Mank,
pieces
yeah.
out there.
I thought Mank was one of the better reproductions of yesteryear Hollywood that I've seen in a long while. I thought you could quibble with the historical accuracy of it, but in terms of the recreation of that era, I thought it did a fantastic job. My eyes were glued to that show.
I think that's something that you do in your books, is that you get the feel of the era. I feel as though I'm watching an era in which the movies that I enjoy are being made. So
Right.
so I can see it happening. Well, it's been just fascinating to hear about this hotel. And I, you know, as I told you, I'm dipping my toes into the series, and I'm really looking forward to catching the rest of it. And I really hope you don't have to wait 35 years to see it.
God, no.
because it really is, the characters are so solid, and it would be wonderful to see on a screen, you know, big or small.
It lends itself. Well, I'll be happy with the movie, but there's so much story there.
It's a TV show.
It would take a TV series
Yeah,
to do it justice, I think.
Yeah, I think so too. Well, thank you for taking the time today, Martin. I really appreciate it, and good luck with all those projects.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for your interest.
For more information about Martin Turnbull, go to watchingclassicmovies.com. Enjoying the show? Please leave a comment and a 5-star rating at Apple Podcasts. It really helps. Thank you for listening. This is Kendall Groover, watching classic movies. Until next time.